This is a 1994 Porsche 968 I'm working on. There's not a lot of 968 content out there, so I figured I'd go ahead and record this while I'm doing a Koni conversion for my front struts. First thing is to get these plastic trim pieces off. I already got the one off the middle there. You can hear that wonderful sound of each 13mm nut breaking with the original yellow paint. I loosen all the nuts out to where they're just flush with the top of the threads, so they'll hold the strut in and keep it from falling before I'm ready for it. There are two 10mm bolts holding this air duct on. And you can see I'm reaching in with the 10mm ratchet again to remove a nut from the ground wire for the ABS sensor. Then I got my little PVC breaker bar with a 19mm socket. Oh yeah, I almost forgot to put my scribe mark on here. The utility knife didn't work too well, but the paint pen worked excellent on the top, so I could make sure I get my alignment at least close when I reassemble the strut. You can see the thread holes right here on the front side where the brake cooling duct was held in place. And you can see on the back side of the strut where the ABS sensor connector just has to get popped out of its holder.
Okay.
I get the bottom end of the strut loose first.
There we go.
And then I can remove the nuts off the top once I'm ready to remove the strut from the car. I found it best to move the bottom of the strut on the back side of the control arm as I pulled the top out of the fender. And then I could tilt the top of the strut out from under the fender. I didn't record the part where my buddy and I used a spring compressor and pneumatic driver to remove the top nut. First step of the Koni instructions is to scribe the base of the strut. I found a nice handy little machine mark at the bottom of mine, so that made it easy to find the center. But I double checked it with a ruler anyway. Put a punch mark there to hold the bit in place when I start drilling. Koni instructions say to start with, I think it was a 3mm drill bit first. Of course, it's always easier to start with a smaller bit and then drill with a bigger bit later. But also this smaller bit releases some pressure from the strut. I didn't record that part, but you do get a puff of air once you get all the way through the bottom of the strut with that first drill bit, so be ready for that. And then we can empty the oil out of the strut. I found it helpful to move the strut in and out while I was draining it. I went ahead and popped the cap off the top, although strictly that's not necessary. I just wanted it out of my way while I was measuring. Koni instructions have you measure the top of their housing down to that little dimple, and then subtract, I think it's 6mm, and cut that amount of metal off the original strut. I scored it with a utility knife, and then I was fortunate enough to be working in my buddy's shop, and he had an exhaust cutting tool, so I was able to use that. But the Koni instructions indicate you can use a hacksaw. I actually tried a diamond grinder, but I found that was a little less precise than what I wanted. This method did leave a fairly big burr on the inside of the housing. I removed that with a diamond cutting bit.
Well, that felt positive.
The hacksaw finishes off the job.
Boom.
And then I was able to remove the strut innards. Everything in there gets disposed of.
Interesting.
Next step is to drill with what Koni calls, I think they called for a 14mm bit. I used the 13mm and that worked just fine. It was plenty big enough for the bolt they give you. Of course, drilling into metal is not without its little jerk there at the end. I like to put the bit in reverse a little bit and get some of those burrs off and then put it back into forward to finish it off. Deburr with a deburring tool. Just kind of a reality check to make sure the bolt's going to fit well. Then the rubber boot goes on. Pushes on a lot easier when you get a nice clean cut like I did today. The first side I did, it was pretty rough getting that rubber boot on.
Okay, so that hits. It's about 3/8.
And what's happening when you put that bolt in the bottom, that Allen bolt, is it's actually drawing the strut into that black housing. When you push it in by hand, it really feels like those dimples on the Koni shock are going to be pretty strong and prevent it from going any further into the housing, but that bolt on the left does a pretty good job of drawing it in. I just used a regular ratchet here to draw the strut in most of the way. And then I pulled the bolt back out to get Loctite on there, because this is the one part of the whole operation I don't want to ever come apart by accident.
I don't have any E's today.
And then I grabbed a torque wrench and set it to 55 foot-pounds per the Koni instructions, and finished off that bolt. Don't forget that plastic bushing. And then the bump stop and dust cover. And once again, I skipped the part about using the shop spring compressor. I just used the pneumatic 22mm driver again to get that nut seated on top of the strut. Reassembly is, as they say, reversive removal. I put the bottom end behind the control arm so then I could get the top under the fender and insert the top. I just get two 13mm nuts started without even putting the washer on right here, since it's pretty tough to hold the strut up with one hand, and then seat the bottom part of the strut. 19mm bolt and nut go on the bottom, 17mm eccentric bolt goes on top, and I think usually a 17mm nut on that. Once those are tight, then I finish tightening the 13mm nuts on top. And I make sure the washers are under all four nuts now. And then the rubber grommets can get put back where they belong. ABS sensor wires can get put back in their little plastic housing. 10mm nut goes back on the ABS ground wire.
Okay, so
And two 10mm bolts hold the brake disc air duct. And then the wheel goes back on, and Bob's your uncle, as they say. Voila, new Koni struts on the front end of my 1994 Porsche 968. Happy motoring.